In controlled conflict experiments recorded in behavioral psychology literature, a subset of participants showed no measurable escalation in heart rate, speech disruption, or facial tension during sustained verbal confrontation. Researchers noted that observers consistently assigned higher perceived authority to these individuals despite identical task performance. The question was not why they were calm, but why others treated that calmness as dominance. In controlled conflict studies conducted across organizational psychology research in the late 20th century, a consistent behavioral anomaly was recorded. When individuals were exposed to verbal challenge, criticism, or social tension, most exhibited measurable physiological escalation, elevated heart rate, speech disruption, and reactive facial signaling. Yet a smaller subset displayed a different pattern entirely. No visible escalation, no verbal acceleration, no attempt to immediately resolve or defend. Thoughtful, they remained still, measured, quietly attentive. What researchers noted was not simply emotional control, it was a consistent absence of visible struggle under pressure. And the question became unavoidable. When a person does not react to emotional pressure in the way most humans do, are they regulating emotion or operating outside of it? This behavior is best examined through the lens of effective response suppression and strategic emotional non-reactivity, a domain intersecting emotional regulation research and social dominance signaling. It overlaps with findings from Daniel Kahneman's dual process theory, particularly the reduced visibility of System 2 override in high arousal environments, and Robert Cialdini's principle of perceived authority under uncertainty. The central distinction is simple but often missed. Calmness is not a single psychological state. It is a category of states with radically different internal mechanisms. By the end of this analysis, you will be able to distinguish between three forms of emotional calmness: regulation, inhibition, and disengagement. They look identical externally. They are not identical in meaning, intention, or social effect. And in conflict environments, that difference determines who is perceived as stable and who is perceived as dominant. In structured negotiation studies, some participants show minimal physiological variation even during escalating verbal pressure. Heart rate remains stable, speech remains unbroken, gestures remain controlled. This is not the absence of stress, it is the absence of stress expression. The nervous system can be activated while its outputs are selectively suppressed. What observers interpret as calm is often only the masking of internal arousal signals. To detect this layer in real life, observe timing rather than expression. If a person responds at the same speed across increasing emotional intensity, they are either highly regulated or deliberately disengaging from emotional mirroring. This ambiguity is where perception begins to split, and that split leads into the second layer. Under normal conditions, humans unconsciously mirror emotional intensity. Raised voices trigger faster responses, tension increases behavioral alignment, but certain individuals do not mirror escalation. They remain behaviorally flat while others escalate around them. This produces a subtle shift in group dynamics. Others begin adjusting themselves downward. Social systems do not stabilize around the most emotional participant, they stabilize around the least reactive perceived anchor. The brain interprets non-mirroring as informational resistance, not emotional neutrality. To detect this, watch group conversations during disagreement. One individual will often cause others to slow down without speaking more. That influence is not verbal, it is structural, and once structure appears, interpretation begins to shift. When emotional feedback is missing, the observer's brain enters recalibration mode. Humans rely heavily on emotional cues to assess relational safety. When those cues are absent, ambiguity increases. Ambiguity does not neutralize perception, it reorganizes it. A lack of emotional reaction is not processed as neutrality. It is processed as unreadable intent. And unreadable intent is often assigned higher social weight than predictable behavior. This is why calm individuals in conflict are frequently perceived as having more control than they are actually demonstrating. To detect this mechanism, notice how people begin explaining themselves more in the presence of someone who says less under pressure. The explanation is not for clarity, it is for risk reduction. And yet, this is where most interpretations stop. The deeper mechanism behaves differently. But here is where it becomes more complex. Not all calmness under conflict signals strength or control. In some cases, the same absence of emotional reaction is linked to emotional disengagement rather than regulation, a reduced investment in relational outcome rather than mastery of emotional state. This distinction is critical. Regulated calmness maintains engagement with the conversation while controlling internal state. Disengaged calmness removes internal investment altogether. Externally, they appear identical. Internally, they are opposites. One form signals controlled participation, the other signals reduced relational dependency. The social system cannot reliably distinguish between the two in real time. This creates a misattribution error. Stability is often assumed where detachment is actually present, and this misattribution is what produces the strongest illusions of natural authority under pressure, which leads into the next layer of interpretation. When individuals consistently do not display emotional escalation, others begin attributing higher decision authority to them. This is not a conscious decision, it is a cognitive shortcut based on predictability under stress. The brain assumes if emotional volatility is absent, control must be present. Authority attribution is often a proxy for perceived emotional resilience, not proven competence. To observe this, notice who becomes the reference point during escalating discussions. The reference point is rarely the most expressive individual, it is the least reactive one. This creates a subtle hierarchy inversion. Emotional expression lowers perceived authority, while emotional restraint increases it, even when no additional competence exists. And this inversion becomes more pronounced under uncertainty. In high-tension environments, groups tend to compress toward one behavioral anchor. This anchor is usually the individual who introduces the least additional emotional variability into the system. Their presence reduces cognitive noise in the group. Decisions begin to cluster around their reactions. Humans do not seek correct answers under stress. They seek reduced uncertainty. The person who stabilizes uncertainty becomes functionally authoritative. To detect this, observe moments after conflict peaks. Watch not who speaks the most, but who others unconsciously pause around before responding again. That pause is where authority consolidates. And once consolidated, it begins to shape interpretation itself. If these patterns are consistent across contexts, then emotional calmness in conflict is not a single trait. It is a surface behavior produced by multiple underlying psychological states, each producing similar external signals but different internal meanings. Which means authority under pressure is not reliably tied to emotional intelligence, moral stability, or even competence. It is tied to how little emotional noise a person introduces into unstable systems. The uncomfortable implication is not that calm individuals are deceptive, it is that human systems are not equipped to distinguish between emotional regulation and emotional withdrawal in real time. And so perception fills the gap with assumption, often confidently, often incorrectly, which raises a final question. How many of the stable individuals you have encountered were actually regulated, and how many were simply no longer emotionally participating in the outcome? Now that the mechanism is visible, 3 practical observations become important. First, separate speech stability from emotional engagement. A calm tone does not guarantee relational investment. Look for continuity of attention, not just absence of reaction. Second, track response elasticity. Regulated individuals adjust their emotional intensity proportionally. Disengaged individuals remain flat regardless of escalation. Third, observe post-conflict behavior. True regulation maintains connection after tension. Disengagement often resets to neutrality without relational repair. The difference is not in how people appear during conflict, it is in what happens immediately after it ends. Once this is understood, emotional calmness stops being a trait and becomes a diagnostic signal with multiple possible meanings. And the final reframing is simple. In human systems, calmness does not always indicate control. It indicates that emotional signals are no longer being used in the expected way. The next layer of this topic examines how emotional unpredictability, rather than calmness, can sometimes function as a stronger form of unspoken authority.